Yeah, I guess so. I'll just unmute
Okay.
and you follow along.
Recording going, I think.
Okay, yeah.
Try to be loud. Yeah.
All right.
We're recording.
Put it in present.
Putting. You're in charge of
And
this.
then I guess just start.
Okay. Start Maria.
What? How am I supposed to know how to start?
Wait,
No, you do
we have messed up again. We can cut this. I hope.
just start recording and then you start on 6.1.
Yeah,
Oh, do you want me to make
Okay,
it
so-
5? Is that what you're saying? I don't know what
Yeah.
you want.
I'll do it. So this is the Unit 6 research project, Japanese imperialism of Korea. 6.1 is rationales of imperialism. This is a quote from Augustine Hurd, the United States minister to Korea from 1890 to 1893, speaking to Durham White Stevens, who is the counselor of the Japanese legation at Washington. This quote exemplifies the concept of the white man's burden, which is the idea that the Western countries, white countries, had the responsibility to civilize and take care of less technologically advanced areas. A phrase that is especially telling of this is when he says that Japan will forget that the object of a conqueror is to get as much possible himself out of the conquest. It sounds eerily reminiscent of how other Western countries were treating the indigenous populations of their colonies. Also, this quote has elements of social Darwinist ideas, especially when Hurd goes on to speak about how much more technologically advanced Japan is and how they would improve Korea's trading. This is the second slide. Here are two political cartoons from the era, both of which exemplify Japan and Korea's relationship. In the one on the left, which is drawn by Bernard Partridge, Korea is stuck in between Japan and Russia. The caption is blurry in the photo, but it reads, "The Korean government has decided to preserve a strict neutrality in the event of a war between Japan and Russia." This happened before Korea had been colonized, but can be used to show that Japan had been an influence there for a while, even before they had officially annexed it. This can also be shown in the second image. This leans towards the concept of social Darwinism, with Japan thinking itself as more superior and therefore deserving of ruling the Korean peninsula. And in the second image, Japan is marching over Korea into Manchuria. This is yet another example of Japan thinking itself better than its surrounding countries, and also stomping over its neighbors. In both images, it's being overly aggressive, which can be used to represent how even before Japan had officially annexed Korea, it was still a major influence there.
6.2 State expansion from 1750 to 1945. Korea and Japan made multiple treaties before Japan's imperialism that were unequal for Korea and limited the power of Korea, which ultimately led to Japan's occupation by giving the power to Japan. Japan's ruling of Korea was oppressive and militaristic, changing the lives of Koreans and taking away their culture until the protests that made it more relaxed and giving limited rights to Koreans. 6.3 Indigenous response to state expansion from 1750 to 1950. This is an excerpt from the Treaty of Annexation in 1910 that ultimately gave the power to Japan. It shows that Japan tricked Korea into thinking that it would be helpful for Korea and their welfare, when it really was not. The March 1919 movement happened because it was a Korean protest that happened against Japan because of their repressive occupation. They oppressed their culture and had lack of freedoms, making them take Japanese last names, changing their language, taking away their history, and giving unfair treatment because of education, mistreatment by Japanese, teachings, labor, taxes, land, and exploitations. In 1919, Korea said that they would be independent from Japan, where Japan answered with the military.
6.4 is the global economic development from 1750 to 1950. Here are two tables on Japanese manufactured products and exports and its primary products and imports. The Japanese were mainly using Korea as a place to gather natural resources as they lived on a small island with finite resources. They wanted things such as gold, lumber, and rice. In the document referenced earlier, where Augustine Hurd is speaking to Durham White Stevens, he goes on to describe the sheer amounts of gold being exported out of Korea and how a bulk of that should be accredited to Japan. This does only reference what happened in 1884 to 1891, but this establishes that Japan had been meddling in Korean exports and trading before they had actually annexed the country. In another source, The Economics of Japan's Imperialism in Korea, 1910-1939, Mitsuhiko Kimura writes that the exporting from Japan to Korea was very minor, but that Japan was importing large amounts of natural resources from Korea. See Table 2. Japan was mainly importing rice, according to Mr. Kimura, mainly because their own rice production was lagging behind because of all their industrialization. Instead of importing from other countries, which means they would have to rely on a potential enemy for food, they used Korea, their colony. Essentially, the rest of the document details other ways in which Japan profited greatly from colonizing Korea. While Korea experienced no great rise in profits, and then in the next slide, here are the Japanese imports and exports from 1900 to 1950. And, as you can see, in 1910, the amounts of exports started to slowly tick upwards, but by 1921 it had almost doubled. The amount of imports had also begun to go upwards and then nearly double at the same time. It's in this way that one can track Japan as it begins to colonize other countries and take advantage of their resources.
Economic imperialism. Economic imperialism, meaning essentially that Japan was taking economic advantage of Korea. Another example of how Japan was taking over Korea is the 1876 Treaty of Gangwon Island, which was an unequal treaty, something often found where Western countries are colonizing places. The treaty allowed Japan special trading permissions when in Korea, but did not offer the same benefits to Korean traders in Japan. Remembering the fact that Japanese exports and imports skyrocketed after it began to properly colonize Korea and surrounding areas, there's a piece in the Japan Times that mentions how rice production increased in Korea, but a majority of the rice was being taken to Japan. Not to mention that most of the workers were tenant farmers who had had their land stolen right from under them by the Japanese. Also, using the economics of Japan's imperialism in Korea, 1910 to 1939, by Mitsuhiko Kimura, we can see even more examples of how rice was exported from Korea straight to Japan. While there is an argument that Japan modernized Korea and therefore helped it, it's evident that Japan did more taking than giving to the Korean people.
Alright, so 6.6, causes of migration in an interconnected world. So the first part of it is pre-migration life, and before immigration of the Koreans and Japanese, life in Korea was pretty simple, and most people were farmers, and they farmed mainly rice and grains, and survived off their own labor and trading. There were a few big cities, and there was not much manufacturing. Now, Japan was not really level with the other countries in Europe in terms of expansion and power, and they needed to expand and gain colonies to make money and provide raw materials to do that and gain power to be in the conversation with the European powerhouses. So this shows an image of the Japanese boats that carried the Japanese military to Korea and before the Russo-Japanese War. And the people that migrated between Korea and Japan used mainly merchant ships to do so. And this picture is an example of the Korean warships. And then the next slide shows a chart of how the production in maritime vessels of Japanese increased a lot over time, and the paragraph on the left talks about how a lot of old vessels were being destroyed and new vessels are being made. So they were innovating and industrializing while increasing the amount of ships that they had in order to trade and colonize and expand. Alright, so causes of migration, why people migrated and why, and their reasons for immigration. So Japan was experiencing a shortage of labor during the 1920s, and the male Koreans that sought like better educational opportunities and employment opportunities migrated to Japan. And most of the Korean immigrants had been farmers, so they had to work heavy labor jobs and manual labor, and the most frequent occupations that they had were construction and mining. Alright, so there was an increase in intermarriage between Japanese and Koreans during immigration, and this was a result of the marriage registration procedure was made a lot simpler, and also the Japanese saw it as a harmonious cooperation between the two races, and so it really helped the Japanese because it was spreading and uniting the colony in Japan under Japanese culture, and so there's a large increase in intermarriage. And by the 1930s, the demographics had expanded in Japan to include both Korean women and children. Alright, so coercion factors. These were forced labor, and the Japanese and Koreans, men and women, were forced to, a lot of them, were forced to go work in Japan and do manual labor in mines and factories, and also there was a lot of Koreans that were forced to go fight for the Japanese Empire in their military. Also, some Korean women were forced to become comfort women or prostitutes for the Japanese Imperial Army as well. So under Japanese rule, they built a lot more schools in Korea, and more students began to enroll in them and the higher education. And so there was a large negative impact on Korean culture because the Japanese were teaching Japanese education and culture in those schools, and so big negative impact. And then the Koreans really struggled to maintain their culture because the Japanese banned their language and history, and they weren't allowed to speak or teach unless it was in the Japanese language. Also, the Japanese government indicated that the three main religions recognized in Korea were Buddhism, Shintoism, and Christianity, and the religious officials had to follow government decisions, and religious activities had to comply with the government as well. So they really didn't have a decision on what they wanted to worship. Alright, so post-migration. So following the annexation of Korea, Japan began to industrialize, and they built a lot of roads, railroads, government buildings, and other things, and they increased the amount of industries, specifically in like steel and coal mines, and Programs were created in Korea that helped economic growth through the government efforts and innovating economic infrastructure. And also by the mid 1930s, about a third of Koreans were born in Japan, and the number of Koreans in Japan increased to over 419,000. So, an effect of immigration was that the amount of Japanese and Koreans living and working in the opposite country or colony increased a lot more, and the graph on the right shows how many Koreans and Japanese immigrated, and it also shows that the majority of the Japanese that immigrated to Korea worked in civil services. Also, the Koreans that immigrated to Japan worked manual labor jobs with low wages, even if they were well educated, because there was almost no jobs because all of them were occupied by the Japanese, as shown in these sources here. And the Korean migrants made up only 2% of the total labor force in Japan. On the other hand, the Japanese in Korea, they also had a low percentage of impact on the labor force, but they also received higher privileges and higher wages.
6.8 causation in the imperial age. Japan follows this prompt exactly because they industrialize, building more maritime vessels for trading and expanding, and an increased amount of factories and labor in order to become on the level to expand and establish colonies like the European countries that began before them. The picture on the right shows the ships they used to transport the military to Korea. They began establishing colonies in Korea and made changes to their government, culture, and religion, uniting them under the Japanese. They were able to use Korea as a source of power and raw materials, which they used to fuel their efforts in the Russo-Japanese War and World War II. And they built coal mines in the coal fields of Korea, like the ones shown on the map. The Japanese and Korean people began to trade and immigrate between the country and colony to find a labor source or were forced into labor. The source on the right shows one of the cars of a train on the railroad built in Korea by the Japanese during the increases in industrialization, and they created industries to support the source on the left. The source on the left is a map of expansion of Japan and the new colonies it forms. Japan did not just stop at Korea, though, because it went on to colonize Manchuria, Mongolia, Thailand, and the Philippines.
Alright, and then we have our works cited